Our discussion last week with regards to evolutionary theory has brought us now to the point where we are going to talk about humans' closest living relatives, non-human primates. In this lecture, we will specifically address how closely the main primate groups are related to one another and how closely they're related to humans. We will address why we should study monkeys as anthropologists, why monkeys and apes are of particular interest to anthropologists, and we will discuss this kind of timetable of primate evolution, when, where, and how the first primates, monkeys, apes, and then hominins evolved. So primatology is defined as the study of non-human primates. This includes both fossil and living species of apes, monkeys, and prosimians. Part of our discussion today is going to address what some of these differences are between these three major groups of primates. Primatology studies primate evolution, it studies primate behavior, primate biology, physiology, studies all aspects, including behavior and social life. There are two particular groups that are of interest to anthropologists. And so, when we address why in the world anthropologists study non-human primates, really what they're interested in is gaining insight into the evolution of modern humans and modern human behavior. And so because we share an evolutionary history, we are expected to share a suite of traits that we both inherited due to that shared evolutionary history. And so because of that, one of the groups of interest to anthropologists are those primates that are the most closely related to us. And so specifically here we're talking about great apes, and of particular interest among great apes are gorillas and chimpanzees. Now when we look at this degree of genetic relatedness, chimpanzees are without a doubt our closest living relatives. When we look at the environment in which humans evolved, this is what we're going to start talking about in next week's module. There was a series of climatic shifts that led to the shrinking of the forests in Africa and the spread of the African savanna. And so this brings up a second group of major interest to anthropologists. There are terrestrial monkeys and apes that live on the ground in this kind of savanna-type habitat. So one example is baboons. Baboons are terrestrial monkeys that do quite well in this African savanna type context. And so we are able to use then, because we expect that similar sorts of environments lead to similar sorts of behavioral and social kinds of shifts, then we, if you recall that principle of uniformitarianism, then we are able to use extant species that are terrestrial, like baboons, as models then for what the social groupings of early humans, early hominins might have been. We are, without a doubt, primates. So I know people come from a variety of religious and cultural backgrounds, but we cannot dispute the fact that A, we are animals, B, we are mammals, C, under this umbrella of placental mammals, we are, without a doubt, primates. So why are we animals? Well, because when we classify life, we're looking at plants, we're looking at the archaeans, or the kind of the ancestral bacteria and such. We've got fungi, we've got animals. We are, in every sense of the way, animals. When we talk about our position as mammals, we have hair, we produce live offspring, we nurse those offspring, we produce milk. So without a doubt, we are, in fact, mammals. And when we talk about primates, we're going to, in just a moment, talk about 6 defining features that are best exemplified by primates that are called anthropoids. And as we talk about those, you'll see that all of those features fit for humans as well as other species like monkeys and apes. So our relatedness to primates is evident in our anatomy, evident in the structures of our brains, evident in our genetics, and evident in our biochemistry. We've got an abundance of biological evidence that supports this close relatedness to primates. When we talk about how we classify organisms, we're talking about what I'd brought up in last week's lecture with Carolus Linnaeus. We're talking about taxonomy. This is the assignment of organisms to categories. And we want to assign organisms to categories because of genetic relatedness based on common ancestry. This is what we refer to as phylogeny, or our phylogenetic tree. So when we look at humans as a whole, we are grouped into what's called a superfamily containing humans and apes. What do we mean by a superfamily? Well, when we talk about taxonomy, we talk about this system, these classificatory units. That the mnemonic device that I learned in high school biology was kings play cards on fine grained sand. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so we've got super families or superclasses or such that exist kind of above the level of families. We've also got subcategories that exist just slightly below that division of taxonomy. And so based on our kingdom, we are animals. Based on our phylum, we are chordates. That means we have a spinal cord. Based on our class, we are mammals because of hair and live young and lactation. Our order is primates. Our family is hominoids. So as we move down these classificatory units, we start to differentiate between closely related species. When we are assigning categories based on taxonomy, we need to recognize this difference between homologies and analogies. Homologies are what we use to classify organisms. These are similarities that are shared due to common ancestry. So for example, as mammals, we are in the class Mammalia. We share these certain mammalian traits like mammary glands. Mammary glands are not something that have separately evolved several times in our evolutionary history. They are something that define this entire class of mammals. At a lower taxonomic level, we belong to the order primates and share other primate structural and biochemical homologies, like opposable thumbs, like this birth of generally constrained to a singleton birth of a baby that takes a really long time to develop. Analogies, by contrast, are similarities between species that result from adaptation to similar selective pressures rather than common ancestry. So, imagine this, let's just pretend for a moment that we're at the beach. You've got kids in the water. Off in the distance, someone sees a dorsal fin. Well, what are they going to yell? They might yell shark, though that dorsal fin could be one of two things. It could be a shark or it could be a dolphin. Are sharks and dolphins related? Not closely related. Sharks aren't even fish because they don't have bones. They're cartilaginous. They're kind of quote-unquote pre-fish. Whereas dolphins are certainly not fish. They have lungs, they have hair, they give birth to live offspring, they lactate. They are mammals. So they don't share a close evolutionary relationship or phylogenetic relationship. So why the similar body structure? Well, that similar body structure arises because of living in a similar environment. When you live in deep ocean, you have to hunt fish. You need to be able to swim fast. You've got to have this kind of streamlined shape. You're not going to be able to successfully occupy that ecological niche, for example, if you've got long legs that you have to deal with. So we see very similar body shapes because of adaptations to this very similar environment. We could say the same thing about flight in birds versus flight in bats, right? The wings are similar structures, but they are fundamentally different because we're not talking about shared ancestry. We're talking about shared adaptations to particular environments. And so convergent evolution is this process by which analogies are formed. So we've got to distinguish here, and this distinction is going to carry us through next week's module as well, the difference between hominids with a D and hominins with an N. So we've already introduced the idea that we have hominoids. This is the superfamily that contains all humans and all apes. That'll include both lesser apes, the gibbons and siamangs, and great apes, including orangutans. Below that, we've got hominids. This is a zoological family that includes fossil and living humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and their common ancestors. So here we are distinguishing between African apes and apes in Asia. And so at the hominid level, we cut out gibbons, we cut out orangutans. Lower than that, we've got hominins. This is a tribe of all human species that have ever existed, including extinct ones, but distinguishes or excludes chimps and gorillas. So there are no apes that are included in this tribe of hominin. It is only species that arose after our separation from our last common ancestor with common chimps. And so we will talk next week more specifically about the traits that demarcate hominins from hominids, but I'll just give you a little tidbit here. One of the biggest markers is the development of bipedality, or upright two-legged locomotion. And so looking at how we might piece together taxonomy and represent it with an illustration, we've got here phylogenetic trees. And so these trees show this close relatedness between all apes, but at a closer level, the African apes are more closely related to humans than are Asian apes. We diverged from Asian apes much longer ago. And then when we look within the African apes, chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than are gorillas. And then we see the separation between chimps and what we would call hominins. So we can either represent this difference by the features or these relationships, which is the top illustration, or we can represent this difference by kind of this date of divergence, which is what we see on the bottom. So between 12 and 15 million years ago, we diverged from orangutans. Between about 6 and 8 million years ago, we diverged from gorillas, and between about 5 and 7 million years ago, we diverged from chimpanzees. So what are these shared primate characteristics then? We belong to the same order, the order primates. Because of that, we share certain traits that have come because of this shared ancestry, this joint inheritance. So primate evolution is best exemplified by anthropoids. These are monkeys, apes, and humans. They constitute the suborder Anthropoidea. Many of these traits reflect a common arboreal heritage. So we've got to think a little bit about what was going on climatically. At the end of this period, right before primates differentiated, we've got the extinction of dinosaurs. And during that asteroid contact and the ecological changes that came as a result of it, we wiped out much of the larger life on Earth. We also then see at this point, 65 million years ago, the appearance of a type of plant that becomes very important with respect to primate evolution. So there's trees are classified as what we call gymnosperms. These are the conifers, or angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants. And so when we think about trees that are angiosperms, these are the hardwoods. The gymnosperms are the softwoods. This is the difference between like apricot and apple trees and pine trees. What comes with flowering on trees? Well, oftentimes it's some kind of fruit, though what's consumed might be the soft flesh around the fruit, or it might be the seed itself. That's what we would consider like walnuts and almonds and such, these nuts that are embedded within fruits. And so a lot of what we're going to discuss then about these key primate characteristics relate to these key traits that were emerging in plants at the time. Primates evolved to fill a niche, dietary niche that's based on fruit, and many of these characteristics reflect that. So for one, we've got grasping or opposable thumbs. We are, or we were, we evolved in this arboreal context. That means that we live full-time in trees. And when we live full-time in trees, we can do that one of two ways. Squirrels are full-time arboreal species, but the way that they kind of maintain contact with and effectively live in trees is through having claws that allow them to dig into the bark. This is why you can watch squirrels scamper up Vertical trunks. Well, we don't have claws, right? We've changed things up. And so we climb with use of our opposable thumbs, and then also something we lost later in evolution, our opposable big toes. Thinking of this arboreal context, one of the primary ways that monkeys move from tree to tree is jumping. They'll traverse open spaces, jumping from the branches of one tree to the branches of another. Having grasping thumbs is really useful in that context because you don't plummet to your death. We have shifted our senses from smell to sight. We've done away with large nasal cavities. We don't have, for example, the same shape face as dogs do. Dogs rely much more heavily on a sense of smell. In addition to just having large sinus cavities, many other mammals also have something called the vomeronasal organ. This is why when your dog wakes you up in the morning because they're hungry, you feel this cold, wet nose on you. The vomeronasal organ is actually right behind the central incisors. And so if you look at species that rely a lot on smell, you'll see that they have a gap between their front top teeth. And you'll also see that they have a split lip, you'll see that they have a split gum, and the vomeronasal organ resides directly back there. And so what happens is smells, the components of smells, which are often hormones, particularly when we're talking about smell communication between between individuals, versus like plants giving off smells. Those particles condense in the liquid that is secreted by the nose. Then that liquid drips down, goes between those open spaces, and the vomeronasal organ is able to pick up the messages that are being transmitted by smell. Dogs are quite capable of this. That's why we use them for tracking and in search and rescue kinds of organizations. We may have things that we smell very well, but when it comes down to it, as a species, our sense of smell is lacking. Instead of having all that area in our face devoted to sinus cavities and organs associated with and space associated with our sense of smell, we instead use that space for our sense of sight. So we've got, for example, kind of more complex optic nerves. We've got an eye that's able to see in color, so on and so forth. And so two features related to our eyesight that are incredibly important are stereoscopic vision, that is three-dimensional vision, and being able to see in color. So as we think about the emergence of those traits, stereoscopic vision, that implies then depth perception. When we talk about this method of locomoting from one tree to another, jumping through open spaces, what's the advantage then of depth perception? Well, clearly you can judge how strong of a jump you have to make. You can judge when the jump is one that you can do versus one that you're not going to be able to clear. And so by having depth perception, we are able to judge distances much better and, again, not plummet to our death. One thing that goes hand in hand with depth perception, though, is having our eyes rotated forward. So if you think about any time that you've been around horses, right, you're taught when you work with horses not to approach them head on, that you're supposed to approach them from the side. The reason is that they've got a blind spot right in that kind of dead-on front center view. They can't actually see anything in front of them. They can only see things that are on either side of them. And so when you approach from the front, you end up spooking them because they can't see you coming. We are able to see everything in front of us and quite a bit off to the side by rotating our eyes forward. When we think about color vision, think again about eating fruits. What color are fruits when they are ripe? Well, obviously that depends on what fruit we're talking about, but the point is that green fruits are usually not ripe, and brightly colored fruits, whether it's red, orange, yellow, they're advertising their ripeness. The fruit wants to be eaten, not that the fruit really has conscious thought, but being eaten is an important part of the fruit's life history. What fruits want is for animals to consume them and then move away from the parent tree and deposit that fruit somewhere at a distance. Not only do animals consume the fruits, but most often they also consume the seeds. Those seeds have evolved to need some kind of process of scarification. Oftentimes, this is related to the passage through consumers' digestive tract. So the acids that are present in our stomach and intestines are able to scar the coat of the fruit or of the seed, which then helps that seed germinate. Additionally, when we think about how fruit seeds are deposited away from the parent plant, they're deposited with a lump of basically fertilizer, being that they are pooped out by the animals that consume them. And so the seed is nicely deposited with the poop as well. That poop acts as fertilizer. Therefore, those fruits that have been consumed by animals are going to be more successful. Those species are more successful because they've moved away from the parent tree, had the scarification in the digestive tract, and they've been deposited with fertilizer. We've had a shift from nose to hand. We don't have claws. Instead, we have nails. We also have a lot of whorls and kind of graphical relief in our fingerprints. So, fingerprints did not evolve as a method of detecting criminals. Instead, fingerprints evolved because by folding the skin in the tip of the finger, you were able to increase the surface area of skin. That gives you more points for the tail ends of neurons to connect to. So by having fingerprints, we've got a better sense of touch. If you've ever had any kind of neurological testing done because you've had a head injury or because of some family history or some kind of neurological episode, one of the things they will test is how well you feel sensation on different areas of your body. And some of the areas that we feel sensation the best include our fingers and our toes. We've seen an increase in brain complexity. Part of this is because eating fruit allows us to grow more complex brains. Fruits are high in calories because of their sugar content. So by eating something that's calorically dense, we are able to grow slightly larger, more complex brains. But another aspect of brain complexity, it relates to our ability to find fruit in the first place. Leaves are relatively ubiquitous. If you eat leaves and somebody comes along and displaces you from the leaves you were eating, all you've got to do really is move over and start eating leaves again. Fruits are fundamentally different. When you're displaced from fruit eating, you've got to then be able to map the appearance of fruits both spatially, because they usually occur in groves and are rather clumped, but also you've got to map those fruits temporarily because not everything is ripe in the same season. So that requires more brain complexity merely to be able to forage or base your diet off of fruit consumption, because you've got to map those resources. So it's both a kind of a cause of brain complexity and an effect of brain complexity. We've got longer periods of parental investment. Fruits take a long period of time to learn how to map them, and brains thusly have to develop and become mature. And so this long period of parental investment represents this time period in which parents subsidize their offspring. And so the key way that we subsidize our offspring is through a prolonged period of lactation. When we look at chimpanzees, for example, they lactate for upwards of 5 years because it takes that long for their babies' brains to grow, for their babies then to become effective at what we call self-feeding. When we look at humans, we could say we wean at somewhere between 2 and 4, but that doesn't mark the end point of parental investment. And so even though weaning happens somewhere between 2 and 4, parental provisioning happens until you're approaching the age of 18 at kind of a bare minimum. So we've taken this aspect of long periods of parental investment and kind of run with it. And then lastly, we've got complex sociality. Sociality is not simply a function of group size. If it were, then we would expect that species like cows or horses or zebras or wildebeest would be incredibly smart. Cows, not so much. They certainly do have distinct personalities and such, but they're not winning on a quiz show or something like that. So this is because they form groups for entirely different reasons. When we're talking about grazing species, they don't really experience high feeding competition as an effect of having large group size. So the reason that grazers have larger groups is because by having larger groups, they minimize the risk of predation for any single individual. So more individuals in the group means more eyes on the lookout for predators. It also means proportionately, if that predator is only going to take one or maybe two animals, you lower the risk as an individual that you were going to be one of those animals taken. When we think about large primate groups, we've got large primate groups despite high levels of feeding competition. So when you've got the primates competing over access to fruits, by having other primates near you, you're reducing your feeding efficiency. You are reducing the absolute kind of amount of food that you're going to be able to take away from this particular feeding site. And so you're willing to bear large group sizes even with that feeding competition. And that requires some different aspects of what we would call intelligence, right? There is a term called the Machiavellian brain. This is also the kind of the social brain. The fact that it relates to the things like theory of mind, or the fact that you recognize that not everyone has the same mental states that you do, and therefore you've got to have some knowledge or some ability to recognize what other individuals are thinking. And so with that comes greater kind of brain complexity, comes social manipulation. With that comes deceit and spite, choosing to not make vocalizations that are reliable or that signal certain death for people who are kind of picking up on those vocalizations. So, for example, vervet monkeys are thought to have hardwired call systems where if they see a particular predator or a particular type of predator, generally it's distinguished between like avian or arboreal predators and terrestrial ones. They make different vocalizations. And one interesting thing about vervet monkeys is that high and low ranking individuals detect predators just as frequently, but high ranking individuals alarm call a lot more frequently. So those low ranking individuals are basically choosing selective mutism to be able to benefit their offspring. If the offspring of a high ranking individual gets picked off during a bout with a predator, then that means there's going to be lower competition for the offspring of lower ranked species.